All right, everybody. Welcome to the Creative Finance Collective. Thank you for joining us. I'm Andy Fowler. We've got Drew Jenkins here. Drew, I see that Scott Horn from Texas is also trying to join us. I'm going to see if he can
Voice
hear us.
only.
Scott, can you hear us?
I got you. Have you got me?
Yeah, I got you. Not the video, but we can hear you. We can hear your audio.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm driving, so you only get audio today. I'm sorry. I know you want to see
Oh,
that pretty
you
face out there.
You out checking properties as an investor, or are you in court as a lawyer?
Oh, I had to go down to beautiful Glen Rose, Texas today and do a probate.
Oh, probate.
So I had to play a little bit of lawyer for the first time in a while.
Ah, well, good times.
Yeah, all fun.
Sometimes we got to do it.
So I need to send you up some dinosaur meat from down yonder.
Yeah, we're always in for. Where do you get the dinosaur meat?
Well, that's what Glen Rose is known for. It's called Dinosaur Valley. It's where all the dinosaur footprints were found.
I see. Okay. Drew, how things in Georgia?
Things are going well. I still can't quite get a sense of the market, right? Some weeks there's a lot going on, and other weeks it doesn't. I think the market isn't quite sure what's going on either. So
Oh,
that's kind
so
of
so
what's going on here.
are you experiencing more recently a busy or a slow market?
We were really busy, and now we've slacked off a little bit. I mean, I think we've only got like 3 or 4 new closings this week, which is pretty slow for this time of year.
Interesting. And so now I know we're talking about creative finance deals here and everything, but as a closing attorney, you're doing, you know, by and large, creative finance doesn't make up some big share of a lot of what you do. A lot of it's conventional stuff, right?
That's correct. So the bulk of it these days is actually commercial, which went real hot and heavy there in the spring, but has kind of backed off a little bit. And then, a lot of regular, like what we call retail, right? But it's not retail with agents as much as it is investors. So it's not creative finance. It's just, investors picking up, more properties, right? More rental properties, more rehab properties, things of that nature. But you're right, the creative side doesn't often come into play, right?
Now, I recently saw kind of just as interest rates are moving and everything else that the typical interest rate on kind of a conventional mortgage had just dropped and is in the low sevens. Do you anticipate when those kind of moves happen that you start seeing more action or activities or
Well, yeah, I
activity?
mean, especially from our refi clients, right? Because we have lenders who are just like mortgage brokerages, basically. And yeah, when there's a drop in rates, people try and jump on to take advantage of it. And when rates go up, they kind of disappear. So they're extremely rate sensitive. One of my lenders who generally does like HELOCs and commercial lines of credit. I mean, I don't know what's going on in that market, but they have just been blowing and going since February, and
Okay,
not really has changed on that side. I don't know if they just have better marketing now or what, but we're getting a lot more business from them than usual for this time of year.
gotcha. Well, since we're taking a temperature, Scott, if you can hear me out there, I mean, I know you do a lot of creative finance, and you do them all over the country, closing some of these deals. Has intensity picked up, slowed down? What have you seen?
In the acquisition side, the subject to side, it's staying fairly steady and fairly consistent. And again, I'm just seeing, at least in the DFW marketplace, on the sales side, where it kind of just is roller coastering a little bit. There are things go by for a month or two, and houses that used to blow off the shelf are sitting, and they're priced right, they're priced well, they're just sitting, and then all of a sudden, boom, you'll sell two houses in a week. But I don't know if that's just I don't think it's normal per se. Um, I think Texas and the marketplace overall is adjusting and getting back to a more traditional sales cycle. You know, I think everybody got spoiled when houses were blowing off the shelves, you know, in a day or two. And now that things are slowing down a little bit, you have to reacclimate yourself to a more traditional marketplace. And that's where I just think, you know, for the guys who are in the investment industry, and if you're buying the homes subject to, I still see an issue out there with that buyers have, and I'll give you an example of that in a moment. And if you're going to lease the property or Airbnb it, whatever it might be, that's not doesn't seem to be an issue. I do think the issue though is on the resale side. I think people are being a little more hesitant right now to pull the trigger, and they're being a little more conscious of values. But one thing I see here in Texas, especially in the investor world for residential homes, are these guys who are trying to pick up the subject to type transactions. And a lot of the homes they're bringing in are the newer homes that were built 12, 24, 36 months ago, which is where a lot of the lower interest rates are. But what's amazing is these people are already behind in payments.
Mm.
And I don't know if they just bit off more than they could chew, if that's a sign of the times we're in right now, or what it is. But what happens is they wind up getting upside down on the property because property values have dipped a little bit. So of course they would have bought at the height of the marketplace, and the
Right.
values drop. And another thing I keep seeing a lot of is these homeowners who have bought a new home. The property was being taxed as lot value, and then all of a sudden it gets taxed as a residential home. Well, the mortgage company doesn't pick that up for a year or more, and now the home buyer is behind 10, 12, $14,000 in property taxes.
Wow.
And of course, these mortgage companies want to recoup those dollars quickly. They don't want to give you, you know, several years to pay those back. They want it all maybe in a year, and they're jacking up the payments for the escrow substantially.
Yeah.
Is it not common
So
practice out
I'm
there
seeing
when
some of that
handling
going
new
on here.
build? Yeah, is it not common practice when handling new build that, you obviously your proration is based on, the most recent estimate, which for Georgia, what we're in the habit of doing is we simply call the assessor and say, even if the assessment's not out yet, right? Assessments are out now, so it's a moot point, but let's say that we're in February. We will actually call the assessor's office and say, hey, what is the value or what is the status of construction completion on January 1st of the year? And sometimes they'll tell you. And if not, we go back to our builder and we say, hey, what was the status of construction? What percent was it complete? And then we use that, against the purchase price to estimate the current year taxes coming up, and we send that to the lender and let them know, yo, last year's tax bill, you're exactly right, vacant land, under construction, whatever it happens to be, just FYI, right? Your tax bill is going to be, we think it's going to be somewhere around X, which is way higher. So we strongly encourage you to escrow, based on our estimates, not based on, the most recent tax bill, which is going to be, as you said, it's going to leave you, behind. Fortunately for us, it's not 10 to 14,000, right? But it may leave you behind the eight ball, 6 to 8,000. Is that
No, and I
so?
agree.
Here's not really an issue.
Yeah, I just think the lenders are glossing over that. You would
We
hope
don't
that
let
the
our
mortgage
lenders gloss over
brokers,
it. We
yeah,
make
and
sure it's
the
on their
realtors,
CDs.
yeah, and you hope that the realtors are advising their clients of that, or somebody is.
They're not.
But on the flip side, though, guys, I also look at borrowers who they don't want to make that higher payment; they want that lower payment, and they just push that off down the road. It seems like, as opposed to paying attention to what's going on. It's as if, I don't know if they just don't know about it, were they not educated about it, or are they intentionally just glossing over it, as I said, in order to retain that lower payment for as long as possible. And then the piper comes, calling, and now you
Right.
got to make these big payments.
Yeah. All right. Well, so that's kind of the temperature of the market. I think a lot of investors, buyers, sellers, whatever you want to call them, are playing the game of waiting to see maybe what the Fed does. Are they going to lower rates? Are they going to cut rates?
Not after today.
Yeah. What happened today? What did I miss? I was busy on a computer all day. I missed something. I want to hear.
Wholesale index went up. In producer price inflation, PPI is higher than estimated. They were guessing it was going to be, I think, 0.2, and it wound up being 0.5. So 2.2% annual producer price inflation. So higher than they wanted, and they've already said we're not cutting rates in this environment. So higher for longer.
Well, there you.
I think it's going to be higher for a lot longer than what we all hope and anticipate and want. Even though you wish in an election year they'd bring it down a little bit, which they may, but man, when you got the debt structure we've got, you've got to find a way to generate income to pay that debt down.
Yeah. Yeah. The Fed's they're in a real problem, and meanwhile, we're all caught up into it. And you mentioned, Scott, you mentioned, people having problems, keeping current on payments, and whether that's kind of a indication of the economy. I read a statistic the other day that 40% of consumer spending, so almost half of consumer spending, is currently right now made up in the top, like, I can't remember if it was 10 or 20% of income earners, but basically the top 10% of income earners. So, the folks that are kind of in the middle and down below aren't doing the lion's share of consumer spending, or the folks way at the bottom. They're busy trying to keep up on their mortgage, which is really expensive, or paying for gas.
One thing that's here that I think is probably causing some of the seize up in the market is home prices obviously are still rising, right? But at least for apartments in the last 12 months, the rent has actually in the Atlanta metro area has decreased 4%. So how are you valuing, if you're an investor and you're going to buy this home for, investment, or you intend to flip it to an investor, right? You're not doing flipping to retail, you're trying to wholesale it to another investor. Pricing becomes a problem because you're buying an asset that has, less and less, has basically negative cash flow annually, right? You still have cash flow, but it's doing worse this year, this period, than it did 12 months ago, but you're asking more money for it. So you're screwing up cap rates right now. And, that I think has a bit to do with it. It's just the pricing is all wonky when the value is going up, but the cash flow it's spitting off is going down. Where are cap rates landing, and how do you calculate that? Are we going to assume that prices are going to go up another 6% and rents are going to fall another 4%? Like, at some point, it just doesn't make sense for anybody. And I don't know how we're going to get around that. And if people are already spending 40% of their discretionary income or whatever, rents can't really go up. So I don't know how the investors are gonna handle that.
Yeah. All right, Drew, it looks like we lost Scott. It might be just you and I, but
we got this.
There could not be a more capable duo. Of that, I am confident. We do have a couple questions. So if you're just now joining us, this is the Creative Finance Collective. We're kind of just talking about things creative finance. So if you have a question, make sure to post it in the chat. We'll get to it. It could be a real estate question, and we'll deal with it. So, question here. Oh, it looks like I heard Scott attempt to come back on. Let me see if we got him. Scott, can you hear us?
I'm back.
You're back. All right.
The phone gods just didn't like me.
Well, that's those wouldn't be the first gods that went toe to toe with Scott Horn.
Yeah.
All right, so we're just addressing our first question here, Scott. And Drew, let me go ahead and read it to you. And I think it's a follow-up from last week. Last week, we spent a little bit of time talking about options. And specifically, I know we spent some time talking about why you don't want your option contract coupled in one document with your lease agreement. I know Drew had a couple things to say about that. Sean had a few things to say about that. But the listener asks, if I'm an optionee on a lease option and a tenant on the leased premises, do I care if the option and lease are a part of the same document? And I think where that question's going is, you care. A lot of our concerns with having it in the same document is that you might have trouble evicting the tenant or having a court interpret this lease and kind of interpret it along with option provisions in the same document, so that it would be better to have a separate lease, a separate and apart from the option agreement itself. That makes a lot of sense from that perspective. But if you're the tenant and the optionee, do you care? I guess that's the question. Does it really hurt you? Is that something that really hurts more the landlord? I think I'm inclined to think that that really hurts more of the landlord. It's more of a problem for them. In fact, if you're the tenant, even better for you if you don't have to get evicted right away. What do you think, Drew?
No, I would agree, and that is our concern, is from the landlord and the owner, seller, optioneur's perspective. Is you might get roped into what I called, the other week, a mortgage by another name. And so if you are the tenant under it, and if things go south with your landlord, I mean, and you're in the same document, and these terms get confused, and lease payments are paying, you're going towards the option price, decreases with every lease payment. I mean, you as the tenant are in a better position to say, Your Honor, this is just a mortgage, and they're just trying to do an end run around the loan laws. So if anything, it's beneficial to you as the tenant, because it's going to be against what your landlord would need to keep things clean in the case things do go south. Is you can make a claim and say, look, these are functionally principal payments under what is functionally a loan, and I have equity, and it gets real hard at that point.
Yeah. Yeah. Scott, is there any reason why you think a tenant or an optionee should care whether they're separate documents, or you think that's more of a option or landlord type concern?
And we lost them again.
I lost him.
I would say, and of course, this is typical anyway when you're putting the two documents together, is obviously a default under your lease can also, especially if they're merged, will operate as a revocation of the option. Right. I've
Mm.
seen that. And it may not work depending on what state you're in, because I'm looking at his next question as well. And in Georgia, and of course we can get to that later, but so it could hurt you if you're in a jurisdiction that will let a default under the lease, revoke the option, basically. And
Mm.
if that's the case, then yeah, if the landlord could come up with hey, you didn't tell me within X number of days there was a water leak, and it's a major repair, and I'm going to declare you in default, right, of the lease or breach of the lease, you could also lose your option simultaneously. So that is something to be aware of if they are merged. But again, that totally is dependent on exactly the language in your contract, and it will vary by jurisdiction. Because in Georgia, that wouldn't work. You wouldn't have an option if you didn't pay separately for it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And by the way, Drew, I agree with that assessment. Are the two documents tied together or not tied together? And it
I think
depends
in
on
his
what.
question, they're the same document. Yeah.
Yeah. As a landlord, part of me goes, well, do I want my house occupied, or is it more important to have the option? But if I terminated the option, do I still want this person to be in my property or not? Probably not. If I'm a tenant, I'd more likely like to have the two separated and not tied together at all, so that if I elect not to buy the home, I can at least still live there under the lease agreement while I make a decision what my next move might be along the way.
All right, so I actually had a file this time last year. We found an attorney to handle it in Alabama, and it was an option and it was a lease, and they were combined in the same document. And the text of that document, the option had been separately paid for, and we were still within the option period. But according to the landlord, the tenant had breached and was in the process of evicting, exactly kind of the situation we're talking about. But since the option itself, even though it was in the document, it was not tied to performance under the lease. We were able, well, not me personally, but we found a counsel who was able to force the landlord to sell by the tenant exercising the option. And so that was a situation. Lots of other factors in this. But the landlord was known for doing this. He would get people in who were not the most sophisticated. They would get the option price up front. It was something like $15,000. And then they would pay rent for 2 to 3 years. And then he would he would say, hey, the lease has expired, right? Which is true. The lease had totally expired by its terms. It was month to month. You haven't exercised your option. The lease is over. Get out of my property. And he would begin eviction proceedings, which is exactly what he did. In this case as well, this was the third person that we found out he had done this to. The difference is, in our case, our tenant client was able to successfully exercise the option. But the landlord didn't want him to do it. But again, since the option, even though it was in the lease, was not tied to the lease terms, we were able to get him to successfully purchase the home he had lived in for the last 3 years. So again, it's very document dependent.
The other thing I was recently looking at, Scott's coming back, just bringing him back on. Yeah, another thing. Now we hear you. Still going along the same line of thought. One of the things that I've seen, even if you're the tenant on a lease with a lease option, that I don't like is oftentimes, especially mostly in a commercial lease context, where I saw this is, the assignment provisions in a commercial lease are always somewhat restrictive for obvious reasons. The commercial landlord wants to knows you as the tenant and has vetted you as the tenant, knows the credit risk that you are as the tenant, but doesn't know what that tenant would look like once you assign it to somebody else. So obviously those landlords will restrict that to say, you can do that, but it requires our approval and review and so on and so forth. What I've noticed where they've got a lease option where it's the same contract, then you tend to be dependent on the assignment provisions within the lease when you want to go assign the option, unless the option has its own kind of assignment clause. And it doesn't make sense I don't think, to have it that restrictive on an assignment. And there's a lot of cases where you want to be able to assign, maybe to a property holding company eventually, if that's who you want to exercise that option or whatever. But that's another area where I've seen it to be a problem if you don't really think through that when you prepare the lease. I think probably the best case scenario is that you always have separate documents there. But I can see from a tenant's perspective or an optionee's perspective where, some of those areas of confusion, like whether they can evict, whether the landlord can evict, and all those kind of things could stand to your benefit as a tenant. Along that same line, we have another question about options. Drew was referring to it a little bit ago. And that goes to the question of consideration, really. And the question is this: can the lease payments on my lease option act as consideration for the option? So maybe worded a little bit different. Can the lease payments I pay on the lease act as separate consideration for the option itself? I think you got a problem there, don't you? What do you think, Drew?
I think it depends on your state. In Georgia and Alabama, you got a problem because options need to have their own separate consideration.
Yeah. What about in Texas, Scott? Do options need separate consideration than the consideration under the lease?
I don't know if I have that exact answer, but my answer would be I would prefer to see the separate consideration, which just helps to keep the documents separate a little bit and keeps the consideration independent of each other. And I think it helps to validate the option better than using a rental payment or the payments, rental payments, as consideration.
Yeah. Drew, when you were pretty definitive about that answer in Georgia, is that based, Arizona, the answer is the same as what you said, Drew, but here it's, it's seen as a separate contract. Every contract requires offer acceptance and consideration, and it needs separate consideration. In Georgia or Alabama, is there like a separate statutory requirement for options, or is it the same kind of contractual elemental requirement?
It's not a statutory requirement. There's case law on it. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay.
Because somebody mixed it up and the courts were like, no. Right.
Yeah. 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 So
hey, Drew, can I ask a question? Do you practice in both Georgia and Florida?
Not Florida, Alabama.
Georgia and Alabama.
Okay.
Yeah. And you do closings in both, right, Drew?
Correct.
Yeah. That's what I
I
thought.
don't do as many in Alabama, but I'm from there, and I just got another contract in from a good friend of mine. We don't do much over there, but we'll still do it.
All right. If you're just now joining us, this is the Creative Finance Collective. If you're watching us from Facebook, there is a barcode at the top of your screen. You can scan that. That takes you right to our YouTube channel. It's just the easiest place to interact with us and our content. You can scan that, go there, subscribe to the channel. We'd appreciate that. If you have questions, we're only going to be on as long as we've got questions. So if you got them, bring them. We've got at least another question here. We'll see if we get more. Still going along the line of options here. How is the option price determined? That is the question. So how do we determine the option price? We've just kind of said as a general rule, the states we're kind of representing here as a general rule kind of require it. Even if they don't, as a best practice, you want separate consideration for separate contracts. But how do you determine what's sufficient consideration? I remember when deeds would always be kind of, you needed a consideration for a deed. That some of that's why you'd have the separate language, for $10 or whatever else on a deed. But I never saw that. Nobody ever wrote the $10 check or whatever else. But what, Drew, in your mind, what do you think is sufficient? Or how is an option price determined? Does it really matter? Or is it really just a dickering back and forth between parties to see what one's willing to pay and one's willing to accept?
I mean, in my mind, an option price is basically, earnest money or good faith deposit, right? In order to hold the property and agree to only sell it to you, right, within the terms of the option. So, as far as what your purchase price is, if that's the option price, you're just negotiating, but you're pre-negotiating a PSA basically, or purchase and sale agreement. But if you're talking about your consideration for it, the way that we've always seen it done here is, again, it functionally is a long-term E&D or EMD or a good faith deposit that you're using to hold, right, the property or to provide the option to purchase. I mean, I think I'm trying to remember all the options I've seen, and it's not too many of them. Um, I mean, generally, in my experience, it's thousands or tens of thousands of dollars, right, for the option price. I've never seen anyone try and get away with a mere peppercorn, right?
Mm-hmm. So Sean St. Clair just joined us. Sean, good to see you. The question here is, how is the option price determined? Because we were talking about consideration for an option.
Yeah.
Does it matter, the price? How do you see parties usually determining that?
You can either have a static price, or you can, make it based upon some determination of, fair market value at some future date. And normally there's a formula for that, so that it can't be subjective, or it can't be open to like dispute. So it has to be like, one party gives the names and numbers of three appraisers, and the other party selects, one of them to value it, and then you go with that appraisal. Or each party has their own appraiser, and if they're within a certain amount, then you go with the middle number. But if they're too far apart, then those appraisers choose a third, and then that, and there's a whole formula for that, for determining fair market value. But you can't just leave it up to and say fair market value. Then you have a vague and ambiguous option, and likely an unenforceable option. But before we go away from that, I do want to ask Drew what his thoughts are on the option fee or earnest money. And back in the day when the market tanked, 2008, 2009, I worked for a firm that did represent a lot of lenders. And so I would fill in for that department in going into court, and both bankruptcy court, eviction court, that type of thing. And, when they needed an attorney to fill in, it gave me something to do, and easy billables outside the office. So I like doing it. But I remember being in bankruptcy court one day, and our client had a lien on this construction project. And all the secured creditors were there, and we were stating our positions. And it was a custom home project, not custom, like a home builder, just not manufacturer, but just regular cookie cutter homes that they were building. And these homeowners were lined up because this developer went under and filed for bankruptcy. And they were all announcing their appearance, and a few of them would ask the judge, like, when am I getting my earnest money back? And they put down like, $5,000, which, to them was a lot of money. And they're like, when do I get my money back? And the judge is like, unfortunately, you're an unsecured creditor, and so you're going to be in line. And frankly, that meant you're not getting your money back. It was kind of the kind way of saying that. So I wanted to kind of pick your brain on what about the idea of, for an option, if you're going to give $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 for an option fee, or for some form of, treat it like long-term earnest money, you put it down. What about the idea of securing the seller or the optioneur's performance under the option via, say, a mortgage or a deed of trust, and record that to give you then a secured creditor status against the real estate?
I think that's really creative. I think it's not a bad idea at all because, again, as merely an optionee, right? Like, the person here is an optionee and a tenant. I mean, nothing prevents the landlord from, taking on additional debt, against the property and getting foreclosed on. And then obviously you can't, exercise your option, right? I mean, you could if your option were filed of record, right? Because that's always something we have to look for in title is, if there's a lease or if there's an option filed of record and it, predates the mortgage or security deed, then obviously it's either a requirement to get approval, right, to have the option waived as to the loan, or it shows up as a requirement, which of course no lender in their right mind would allow it to be done. So you can certainly record your option, just like you can record your lease, other than the fact that your lease and your option probably prohibit it by its very terms, right? That's typical, unless you're dealing in commercial. And if it is of record, and we had this happen, and we had it happen with a commercial parcel in Alabama that contained two buildings. One was a restaurant, and the other was like a 3-pack strip. And one of the tenants in the 3-pack strip had an option to purchase, but it was vaguely defined. And so the owner had split the parcel and was selling off the restaurant portion of it. And the tenant realized it and threw up a big fuss about their option, which of course we were unaware of because it was a separate parcel of land, and we didn't, and the lease was not filed of record, so none of this came up. But it came up because they discovered it. And it wound up being an entire lawsuit, which got tossed for being too vague, right? You had the option to purchase, but were you allowed to purchase your unit within the 3-pack, or were you going to purchase the entire thing? And if that were the case, the price was crazy cheap. It was obviously meant for his unit, right? So yeah, I don't even think it. I mean, to protect your ability to get it back in the event of a bankruptcy or another thing, having it structured as some form of a deed to secure debt, mortgage, whatever, is a great idea. But you can still kind of protect your interest just by having that option filed, because title is going to raise it as a requirement to get this solved. So
Yeah, I think the memorandum definitely locks in your position on the property, but I'm not sure that it would give you
protection in
secure
bankruptcy.
creditor status in a
Yeah.
bankruptcy.
I mean, I think it sounds really, really good. And the way that I would just, run it through my head is you would structure, as you said, a performance is that the consideration or the payment is you owe me this money back unless and until, right, it expires, the option expires under its terms, or I exercise my option, right? So that's sort of your consideration for it being a deed to secure debt or a mortgage of some kind is we're all agreeing that I get this money back if you are unable to perform and I attempt to exercise. Because again, we have to have a note or something underlying this beyond just to secure it, right? Like you can't, and I don't know how it works in Arizona, but and I'm not sure how it works here either with that respect, is figuring out, you have to have an underlying debt of some kind. And so you would structure the
Right.
option fee as a form of a debt that's a contingent debt on performance or, maturity according to its terms.
Correct. Yeah. So in Arizona, and Scott Horn and I had this discussion, you have to have an underlying obligation. So that would either be a note, but it could be another form of agreement. Like I've secured settlement agreements with deeds of trust before where, there were payment terms under the settlement. We're like, well, we want to lien against the property. And so we secured the settlement agreement, but it had some performance or some obligation to perform, outside of just the terms of the contract, if you will. So yeah, you may need to do a note, or you may need to be very express with your language in there as far as, when do you get your option fee back? I.e. in the event of bankruptcy, or you fail to perform, or, that type of thing, or you go and encumber the property or whatever.
Okay.
All right. Good discussion. We have another question. Now we're moving away from the option question, but are you seeing an increase in foreclosures in 2024? Anybody seeing an increase in foreclosures?
So I generally don't handle foreclosures, but I am aware among my peers that do, is that yes, that is a business that is that's doing very well right now and doing better.
I can't say that I've seen an increase one way or the other. I do foreclosures, but I don't do them on behalf of a big foreclosure kind of law firm or trustee sale law firm outfit. So I'm not sure. What I've seen is indicative of, larger market trends. Scott isn't with us anymore. Sean, have you seen, I guess it might be better to say, have you ever seen any deals that you've been a part of, or more of them going south in foreclosures?
I mean, there have been foreclosures pending that were then reinstated as part of the transaction, but and it is happening. The thing about Arizona though is we're still seeing appreciation in our market, and in fact, I was just reading an article about that, and so. Yeah, because we're still seeing appreciation, I don't see that there's less foreclosures. I mean, I think we would have to see a pretty good dip in housing prices to really see an uptick in foreclosures, because our market is still fairly strong in Arizona and Wisconsin. We don't have big movements one way or the other. There's a little uptick here in Wisconsin, but it's nothing like major. Almost
What happened to y'all's taxes
the point where it's
out
quite
west?
normal. I'm sorry, what,
Yeah.
Drew?
I said, what have happened to y'all's taxes out west? Because the thing that's been killing us in the Southeast is, and of course, Florida is even worse with insurance, is our tax rates have just gone through the roof. Like I think DeKalb County went up by like more than 30% last year. And like Andy was saying at the beginning, there's so many people that are struggling already, and then when taxes go up, I mean, that's been our issue here is, the governments are suffering, right, from their revenue from property taxes, so they just jacked up their millage rates, and to try and cover the shortage. And so we've had people whose taxes, skyrocketed. Like, you make a projection, and you estimate taxes and insurance are going to go up by what, 1.5% per year, I think is what the old pro formas had. And then you get hit with a 30% increase in a single year. I mean, it totally destroys your models. And if you're not, cash flush enough, you're going to be in real trouble. And I think that's what we're seeing here is the outcome of some of that.
Is taxes
Welcome to our wonderful Texas.
Yeah, I was going to
problem.
say it almost sounds like a Texas problem, given that their property taxes are a little higher. You see that a lot, Scott?
Oh yeah, and they just keep going up. And of course, here in Texas, several counties have found a new way to get around your property tax protests, where they're jacking up your land price to a much higher value and keeping the structure price the same. Well, the problem is it's easy to protest for your structure and the condition and those kind of things, but how do you protest your taxes for the value of the land when they try to make it uniform across the entire neighborhood? And it just is just shooting you in the foot a little bit in getting the taxes down or trying to get them down. We filed about 8 or 10 tax protests a few days ago here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And we have a house that we had bought for $225,000, and the house was in pretty much disgusting condition. It'd be the best word to use for it. My rehab cost is probably 60, a retail rehab cost 75 or 80 to get it to market value. And it's being taxed right now at 3.25, and the government, they came back and offered us $319,000. And of course, you just look at that and you go, "Are you just kidding me? Really?" I mean, they're not even trying sometimes. And of course, most people don't even know how to protest taxes, or they don't want to mess with it, and they just write that higher check. And it's just incredulous what the taxing jurisdictions do. And the people who make these decisions sometimes aren't the appraisers who they should be. It's these lay people who in making a decision.
Yeah. Taxes. They get you coming and going. All right. So we have another question. Now that we're past the forbearance phase, do you see the foreclosure timeline being shorter? I'm not sure does anybody have an idea what they're getting at there?
I think they're talking about with COVID when, the feds tried to say you couldn't foreclose for a while, right? But that didn't have anything to do with the timeline. That was just a unique circumstance of federal government overreach, right?
Right.
That finally got slapped down. So I think foreclosures are still operating on their normal, right, statutory and private sale or judicial frameworks. I
Yeah.
think they're still normal.
Still, yeah. I think that's right. Nothing's changed here in Arizona. If you're doing a private trustee sale, it's 90 days from the date of the notice of trustee sale is when that auction's gonna happen. You may be right, Drew. It may have been forbearance for COVID times, waiting before you could institute a trustee sale. Certainly, there was a lot of that with evictions. But good stuff. Well, that's all our questions, guys. I don't know if we had anything else to add, but we've gotten to all the ones that we have so far. So what we'll go ahead and do is close her out. Appreciate y'all joining us. Drew, good to see you again. And let's do it again next week. Thanks so much.
Listen, thank you, everyone.